In 1955, the world was holding its breath. The Cold War was no longer a shadow. It was a living presence in every home, in every classroom drill where children were told to duck under their desks, as if a sheet of wood could stop the fire of a nuclear blast. It was the age of fear and of excess, when nations believed survival depended on machines so powerful that their very existence promised the destruction of the enemy. Out of this atmosphere of dread and determination came a shape that seemed too large, too loud, and too monstrous to belong in the sky. When it first roared into view, people felt the ground tremble under their feet. 8 engines in unison created not just sound, but vibration, a physical force pressing against the chest. It was the B-52 Stratofortress, a name chosen deliberately because nothing less than a flying fortress could capture what this aircraft represented. To see it take off was to witness a nation flexing its will to dominate the nuclear age. The B-52 was not born from a single idea, but from a string of failed concepts, rejections, and redesigns. Boeing engineers began by sketching a propeller-driven bomber only to see that vision collapse under the speed of the jet age. Then came hybrid designs, swept wings, and endless revisions that were torn apart by the US Air Force before ever reaching the wind tunnel. It was a race against both technology and time. The United States needed a bomber capable of carrying nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory without stopping, one that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything before it. Engineers called it Mission Impossible, but the impossible was exactly what was demanded. Against the ticking clock of geopolitics, they settled on a daring layout, swept wings extending almost 60 meters, a thin and elongated fuselage, and engines paired in pods under the wings like clenched fists. If the roar of history and the shadow of giants like the B-52 kept you captivated until this very moment, then you already know how powerful these stories can be. Imagine what else waits in the skies and in the secrets of machines that changed the world. Do not let this journey end here. Make sure you subscribe, so every time another hidden chapter of aviation's legacy is revealed, you will be the first to witness it. The next story is already on the horizon, and you will not want to miss the sound of its engines. When the prototype XB-52 finally rolled out in 1952, the world of aviation was stunned. It didn't just look large, it looked alien. Its landing gear wasn't the simple tricycle layout of common planes, but a strange swiveling system that allowed the wheels to pivot, helping the massive aircraft adjust on narrow runways. Test pilots admitted that the machine felt unstable, even menacing, when they first tried to coax it into the air. Every creak and vibration suggested that the entire behemoth might rip itself apart mid-flight. But each flight pushed the limits further, and with every successful landing, the impossible seemed a little more possible. The heart of this beast was its power plant. The early models carried 8 Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines, each one a product of an era when engineers tested metal by burning it to its limits. These engines devoured fuel at a rate that shocked even the Air Force, but they also gave the B-52 the legs it needed, over 14,000 kilometers without refueling. Imagine sitting inside such an aircraft for hours on end, the metal skin around you vibrating constantly, the howl of the engines never letting you forget the speed and weight of the machine. To the men who flew them, the Stratofortress was less an aircraft than a mechanical storm that they were lucky enough to ride. Its size alone forced adaptations everywhere it went. Hangars had to be redesigned, runways extended, fuel logistics rewritten. On the ground, children would watch in awe as the giant rose above the horizon, its contrails stretching across the sky like scars. To stand near the runway during takeoff was to feel the ground shake as though a small earthquake had begun, with windows rattling miles away. This wasn't just another bomber, it was a statement, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It told adversaries that the United States could build something so oversized, so overpowered, that it defied logic, and that it was willing to use it. Every feature of the B-52 spoke of ambition. The wings, thin and flexible, bent visibly under their own weight when the plane was on the ground, then arched upward as the aircraft lifted into the air. The crew, usually 5 men packed into the forward cabin, faced long, grueling missions that could stretch for more than 20 hours. To them, comfort was an illusion. Seats were cramped, noise was relentless, and sleep was nearly impossible. And yet they accepted this burden because they knew the bomber's very existence was reshaping the balance of power. The B-52 wasn't meant to fight dogfights or dodge bullets. It was designed to deliver the unimaginable, a nuclear payload capable of flattening entire cities. The arrival of the Stratofortress changed not only aviation, but also strategy. The Soviet Union suddenly had to rethink its defenses. High-altitude interceptors, radar systems, and anti-aircraft missiles were rushed into production, all because of one aircraft that made every Soviet planner ask the same question. Could they stop it before it released its bombs? The B-52 forced its enemies to spend billions to counter it, proving that its influence reached far beyond the range of its wings. But the true measure of this machine wasn't just its power, it was its survival. Other bombers from that era faded quickly, replaced or retired, their designs outdated within a decade. Yet the B-52 endured. Even in its early years, military analysts speculated that this giant might outlive the very wars it was built to fight. They were right. Every time a new fighter jet was introduced, every time a new missile threatened to make bombers obsolete, the B-52 adapted. It was upgraded, stretched, reinforced, modified. Like a veteran soldier with scars, it carried the evidence of past conflicts while preparing for the next. In its first decade of service, the B-52 went from a shaky prototype to the backbone of American strategic power. It represented a promise and a threat at the same time, a promise to defend and a threat to annihilate. Pilots and ground crews who worked with it spoke of the pride and the terror of serving on a machine designed for global destruction. The noise, the size, the sheer audacity of its design, everything about it was meant to overwhelm the senses and the imagination. To look at a B-52 was to look directly into the philosophy of the Cold War itself, survival through the ability to destroy. And yet, as its reputation grew, so did the questions. Could such a massive machine remain relevant in a world that was changing so quickly? Could it adapt as missiles became more precise and defenses more advanced? The Stratofortress had proven it could fly, it could endure, and it could terrify. But soon it would have to prove something even greater, that it could carry the unbearable weight of nuclear readiness, not just in tests and parades, but in the very real and terrifying theater of the Cold War. Would the B-52 be merely a giant built for show? Or would it become the constant shadow looming over every enemy capital, night after night, decade after decade? That was the question as it entered the heart of the Cold War, where its engines would no longer roar just in testing grounds, but in missions that could decide the fate of the world. The Cold War was not a conflict fought with tanks on European plains or infantry in distant jungles, at least not at first. It was a battle of nerves, a theater of constant readiness where the ability to respond instantly with annihilation mattered more than the actual use of weapons. At the center of that doctrine stood the B-52 Stratofortress. It was no longer just a prototype or a new machine in service. It had become the very embodiment of nuclear deterrence. Day and night, B-52 crews sat in cockpits, engines warmed, bombs armed, ready to unleash destruction at a moment's notice. The United States called it peace through strength, but for the men who lived it, it was a reality where the line between routine and apocalypse was thinner than the wings that carried their aircraft. By the early 1960s, programs like Operation Chrome Dome kept bombers constantly circling in the skies. Imagine a fleet of B-52s, heavy with nuclear weapons, always airborne, always positioned to strike the Soviet Union within hours. They flew in endless orbits over the Arctic, over the Atlantic, and across the Pacific, while others stood on alert runways, engines howling, crews waiting for a single coded order that could end civilization. The world lived one mechanical failure or one false alarm away from catastrophe, and sometimes the worst nearly happened. In 1961, a B-52 broke apart over Goldsboro, North Carolina. 2 nuclear bombs fell from its belly, one of them arming itself almost completely before a final low-voltage switch failed to trigger detonation. If it had exploded, it could have erased entire cities along the eastern seaboard. That incident was never widely discussed at the time, but it haunted those who understood how fragile the balance truly was. The B-52 was designed for nuclear war, but the United States quickly learned that its vast bomb bay and immense range could serve other purposes. By the late 1960s, as American involvement in Southeast Asia deepened, the Stratofortress was called into a very different kind of mission. Instead of carrying hydrogen bombs, it now carried endless racks of conventional bombs, each one destined to fall on jungles, villages, and cities thousands of miles from home. The sight of dozens of B-52s launching in tight intervals became routine on Pacific bases like Anderson and Guam, where their thunder shook the island as they rose one after another, a steel procession headed toward Vietnam. For the soldiers on the ground, the sound was reassurance. For those on the receiving end, it was terror. The campaign over Vietnam revealed a new side of the Stratofortress, known as arc light missions. These operations dropped staggering amounts of ordnance. A single B-52 could release more than 100 bombs in one run, and entire formations could transform square kilometers of terrain into a blasted moonscape. Enemy forces called them sky giants, and often broke under the shock of their bombardments. Yet the missions were not without cost. The North Vietnamese learned to adapt, weaving intricate webs of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles across their skies. For the first time, the giant fortress met an enemy determined to bring it down. Pilots described the sight of dozens of missile contrails rising from the ground, each one snaking upward toward their formation, each one a reminder that no machine, however vast, was invincible. Some B-52s never returned. Crews that had spent hours flying toward their targets vanished in sudden bursts of fire, the behemoths crashing into jungles far below. Those who survived described the experience as waiting inside a giant target, listening to the electronic warnings blare as missiles locked on, knowing that the Stratofortress was too large, too slow to escape. Yet the B-52 endured, and its presence was decisive. Operations like Linebacker 2 in 1972 saw massive waves of B-52s unleash destruction on Hanoi itself, pushing North Vietnam to the negotiating table. The campaign was brutal and controversial, but it underscored the unique power of the bomber. It could not win a war on its own, but it could alter the course of one through sheer weight of fire. To the men who flew them, those missions became seared memories. Hours of quiet flight across oceans, followed by minutes of chaos and fear as anti-aircraft fire erupted below, then the long, tense journey home with fuel dwindling and engines strained. Some recalled that the most haunting sound was not the roar of the engines or the blasts of flak, but the eerie silence in the moments after the bombs fell, a silence broken only by the distant rumble of cities burning. The B-52 had been built to frighten the Soviet Union with its nuclear potential, but in Vietnam, it became a very real and very visible weapon of war. Its reputation grew darker, yet also more complex. The Stratofortress was both savior and destroyer, protector and punisher. To American troops pinned down in jungles, the arrival of B-52 strikes was a miracle that could wipe out enemy positions. To those who lived under its bombing runs, it was a phantom of destruction that turned night into fire. And still, even as the Vietnam War tested its limits, the B-52 was only beginning its long service in conflicts that would stretch far beyond Southeast Asia. When the war ended, critics predicted the age of the giant bomber was closing. Precision missiles and sleek fighters seemed destined to replace lumbering giants from the 1950s. Yet the B-52 refused to fade. Its sheer capacity, its adaptability, and the simple fact that no other aircraft could carry such massive loads over such great distances kept it at the center of American strategy. While it had proved its power over the jungles of Vietnam, the looming question was whether this ancient monster of the skies could survive in a new era, one where technology advanced faster than ever and new wars demanded new forms of warfare. That question would follow the B-52 into the next decades, as the Cold War deepened once more and new conflicts erupted across the globe. The Stratofortress had shown it could terrify enemies from the skies of Southeast Asia, but could it continue to matter in a world of satellites, precision weapons, and increasingly hostile skies? The answer would not be found in history books, but in the way the bomber kept reinventing itself decade after decade, as if time itself could not kill it. And that is where the story of the B-52 moves from legend into something even more extraordinary. By the late 1970s, the world was changing, but the outline of the B-52 still haunted the skies. Many believed it was a relic of the nuclear standoff, a giant from the 1950s that should have been left behind like the black and white newsreels of its youth. And yet the Stratofortress refused to fade. Engineers found ways to extend its wings, to rewire its nerves, to modernize its brain. Avionics were replaced, navigation systems rebuilt, radar upgraded. A machine originally designed with slide rules and drafting tables was suddenly talking to satellites, guiding precision weapons, and carrying out missions undreamed of by its original creators. It was as though a veteran soldier had been fitted with new armor again and again, re-entering the battlefield each decade with scars, but never with defeat. When the Gulf War erupted in 1991, many thought it would be the swan song of the Stratofortress. Surely stealth aircraft and cruise missiles would now dominate modern combat. But when the first waves of Operation Desert Storm began, it was the old B-52s that delivered some of the most decisive blows. Flying from Louisiana to the Persian Gulf, they launched missions that lasted more than 30 hours without landing. Entire Iraqi divisions dissolved under the relentless carpet bombing that followed. Soldiers on the ground reported that the sound of B-52 strikes was like thunder that never ended, shaking the desert floor until morale itself cracked. It was proof that, while the world had moved into a new technological age, brute force from above still had a role to play. The Stratofortress had survived the jungle, and now it proved its dominance over the desert. Even in conflicts where stealth fighters and precision drones took center stage, the B-52 remained in demand because no other aircraft could carry such vast arsenals across such immense distances. In Afghanistan and Iraq after 2001, the giant did not drop seas of unguided bombs as it once had. Instead, it carried smart munitions, guided by GPS, striking targets with terrifying accuracy while circling patiently for hours. The bomber that once flattened entire landscapes could now destroy a single building without touching the house next to it. This transformation kept it relevant, turning a Cold War monster into a precision instrument of modern war. Crews joked that the aircraft was older than their parents, but its abilities belonged to the future. What makes the B-52 extraordinary is not only its adaptability, but also its longevity. Aircraft are supposed to age, to crack and weaken until they are retired. But the Stratofortress seemed to laugh at time itself. Maintenance crews replaced wiring, reinforced airframes, and introduced digital cockpits where once there had been dials and analog gauges. Plans for its retirement appeared again and again, but each time the Air Force found it easier and cheaper to upgrade than to replace. In the end, it became clear the B-52 would outlive most of the aircraft designed to replace it. The B-1 Lancer and even the B-2 Spirit entered service decades later, but both are expected to retire before the oldest Stratofortresses leave the flight line. There is something surreal about watching an aircraft designed when Dwight Eisenhower was president still taking off in the 21st century. Some B-52s in service today were built in the early 1960s. Grandfathers who once maintained them during the Cold War now watch as their grandchildren fly the same airframes into combat. The bomber has become a living bridge across generations, a machine that refuses to die because it continues to find new reasons to exist. It is not just a weapon, it is an heirloom of American power. And with the latest modernization program, fitting it with new Rolls-Royce F-130 engines, digital systems, and the ability to launch hypersonic weapons, it is poised to serve into the 2050s or even beyond. That means a single airframe could see nearly a century of service, a record almost unimaginable in aviation. Yet the B-52 is not just about wars and upgrades. It has seeped into culture in ways few machines ever have. It appears in films and music, even in satire. The cult classic Dr. Strangelove burned it into the public imagination, where the image of a pilot riding a nuclear bomb like a cowboy became a metaphor for the madness of the Cold War. A band named themselves the B-52s, their beehive hairstyles inspired by the bomber's silhouette. The Stratofortress is not just a machine of destruction. It is a symbol, both feared and mocked, celebrated and cursed. Its silhouette is instantly recognizable, a reminder of both the horrors it was built to deliver and the marvel of its engineering. Those who have stood close to it describe a feeling that borders on awe. Its wings flex like the limbs of a giant bird, its engines roar with a deep and ancient voice, and its bulk seems too massive to leave the earth. And yet it rises again and again as if weight and age were meaningless. For pilots, it is both a challenge and a privilege to fly. For adversaries, it is a nightmare that keeps returning. And for historians, it is a paradox, a machine born for the end of the world that somehow became timeless. As the decades roll on, the question persists. How long can a single design remain at the core of global power? Each modernization pushes the answer further into the future. Each mission reminds the world that this colossus is still relevant. The B-52 is more than just an airplane. It is an echo of an era when fear and power were measured in megatons. And yet, it is also a promise that no matter how warfare changes, some giants are too adaptable to vanish. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Because if a machine built for nuclear Armageddon can outlive the age that created it, then maybe the shadow it casts will never truly disappear. It will keep rising with the dawn, its 8 engines howling across new horizons, reminding us that the fortress in the sky was never meant to be temporary. It was meant to be eternal.